The American military hasn't always been as powerful or respected as it is now. I want to share with you one of the first steps that the American military took to becoming what it is today. Welcome. I'd like to consider myself a little bit of a military history nerd, and I wanted to share with you all some of the things that I think are interesting in one way or another. Today we're talking about a battle in World War I that helped to establish the United States as a legitimate military power. The Battle of Cantigny was the first major offensive that the United States Army took part of during World War I. There will be a few terms and tactics used throughout the video that I'll explain as best I can. Since we are talking about World War I, we of course need to start with context. Late 1917, the US joined the war in Europe after a few key events. 1. The sinking of the passenger ship, the Lusitania, which was a result of the German policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. 2. The Zimmermann telegrams, which were messages sent to Mexico from Germany proposing an alliance in the case that the US joined the war, where Germany promised Mexico that they would help to return former territories back to them. When the United States joined the war, the military was very undersized compared to those in Europe. In the Army, there were around 127,500 officers and soldiers, which seems like a lot, but if you compare that to the British Army, not counting their colonial contributions, they had roughly 4 million soldiers, so there was a lot of buildup that had to happen. The United States would end the war with an army of around 2.4 million, but we weren't there yet. When the United States Army arrived in Europe, there was an idea amongst the other leaders of Britain and France that the United States Army would serve as replacements to their more experienced units and help to recoup their losses, while the US leadership wanted to keep their own troops independent. So that's where we sit in June of 1917, when the 1st Infantry Division arrived in France. This division you may know as the Big Red One for their unit insignia. They show up in France and begin their training. Fast forward to March 1918. The 1st Infantry Division has completed their training, and 4 other divisions have arrived and begun their training. On the 21st of March, 1918, the Germans attacked the British and French armies along a 40-mile front right where the armies joined at a city called Amiens. The city was a railway link, and the Germans hoped to split the two armies. The United States Army was called to help defend the line. The Americans were ready to show that they were an effective combat unit, and they would get their chance. The village of Cantigny was on a plateau, and therefore granted whoever controlled it excellent observation positions for the surrounding area. The area was also a salient created by the German offensive. A salient is a bulge in the line where some parts of an offensive are more successful and can push farther than other areas. On May 28, 1918, the attack was to commence. The stage was set. The Americans, peppy newcomers trying to prove themselves. The French allies, waiting to see if the Americans could be trusted in combat. And the Germans, who were trying to break the Americans back before they could get an established army in Europe. The day did not start the greatest, because at 4:30 that morning, the enemy shelled the 1st Division's lines, and also launched a raiding party that was ultimately repelled, but there wasn't a lot of sleep to be had. At 06:45, the 28th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division began their advance after an hour-long artillery bombardment. The advance would follow a rolling barrage, or a creeping barrage. This was an artillery tactic that required precise timing. Essentially, it meant that the artillery would stay in front of the advancing troops and move when they did to keep them covered. At a pace of 100 meters every 2 minutes, the Americans advanced. The French provided artillery support, along with air cover, trench mortars, tanks, and flamethrowers. The 28th Infantry stayed on schedule and kept pace with the barrage as planned, and the French tanks that accompanied them took out machine gun placements to clear the way. There was minimal resistance inside the village after the initial bombardment. At 0720, the American troops reached their objectives and began to set up security over the captured territory. During the taking of the town, 5 officers and 250 German soldiers were taken prisoner, and according to them, the attack came as a great surprise. So far, so good. Meanwhile, the troops that made it out to the objectives began to dig in. Unfortunately for them, the supporting French artillery was diverted to fire at another section of the line where the Germans were advancing. Time for another new term: counter battery fire. Counter battery fire is a tactic that uses spotter planes, in this case, to spot where the enemy artillery is firing from, and then firing your own artillery onto their artillery to keep their heads down so that they can't fire on your troops. That's what the French artillery was doing while the Americans advanced. Now that the counter battery fire was missing, the German artillery could be brought to bear with great effectiveness against the new American positions. It turned out the easiest part about this offensive would be the actual taking of the village itself, because for the rest of the day, and another 2 days on top of that, the word was counterattack. The American positions would be tested again and again by artillery and infantry attack, culminating with a great final counterattack on the 30th of May at 5:30 a.m. It started with a tremendous artillery bombardment, followed by a rolling barrage that led 2 waves of German infantry. These waves crashed against the stone of the American lines, but were repelled. That night, the American forces were finally relieved. It had taken 45 officers and 1,022 men killed, wounded, missing, or gassed to show the world that the American military had what it took to stand both against and alongside some of the best militaries in the world. And for those of you still here, I would like to read a short commendation letter written from the commander of the 1st Infantry Division to the commanding officer of the 28th Infantry Regiment. The division commander takes great pleasure and feels it is his duty to recognize, as much as in him lies, the gallant and efficient action and bravery of your regiment in the taking and holding of Cantigny for 3 days, May 28th, 29th, and 30th, under the most determined resistance and repeated counterattacks of the enemy. Your losses in officers and men were very large and strain upon you very great, but you won. Your conduct was admirable. The division commander will use every effort to cause due recognition to be given to all worthy instances of gallantry and self-sacrifice. Communicate the thanks of the division commander to your regiment. Signed, R. L. Bullard, Major General, Commanding.